Hello and welcome to the Dad Dialogue podcast, the show where we talk about the successes and the stresses of becoming a dad and being a dad. I am your host, Laurence. Thanks so much for being with us today. Today is a super special episode. It is another episode of Dad Diary, and this is the first episode of the Dad Diary Deep Dive, a show where I'm going to take a topic and go deep into that topic and look at different aspects of that topic within the parenting space, looking through the lenses of research, my own experience, and some of the experience of the guests we have had on the show before. I'm glad you're here listening. This episode is available on all platforms. This is the first episode of the Dad Diary Deep Dive. Just so you know, future episodes that will be coming monthly will then be on Patreon only. So do go out over to Patreon, check that out if you'd like to sign up and listen to future episodes of Dad Diary Deep Dive. But today, let's get into our topic, which is going to be screen time. Now, today in this episode, I'm going to lay out for you the different areas we're going to go over. Right now, I'll give you a little bit of a brief pathway of where we're going to get to, where we're going to go. So I'm hoping to look at overall screen time use in terms of numbers and what some of the research says in terms of these numbers and what's recommended and what have you. We're then going to look at the different views towards screen time as a whole, what some of the experts say about just the actual use of using devices. Then we're going to look at the difference between the quality and quantity of content when it comes to using screens. And I think this is a really important topic that maybe some people don't think about too much. Then we're going to talk a little bit about safety online, being safe online, ensuring you're in control and you know what's happening and what your kids are seeing, what the risks are, etc. And then we'll try and wrap everything up with the conclusion and possible next steps that maybe you can take or other parents can take throughout this whole experience, throughout this whole journey that we're going on this path. I will be sharing research, trying to make it clear to you what research I'll be sharing. All the links to different studies and videos will be in the description if you'd like to go out and check out those sources, if you'd like to learn more about it, see where some of the numbers come from. And I'll try and make myself very clear about maybe when I share some of that research, I'll have my own comment on it from my own personal perspective. And that will always just be my perspective and how that applies to me and my context. And the important aspect of this format that we're looking at is how some of these topics are very complicated. They have lots of nuance, lots of context is important. So my context is important in terms of my life and my children and my family. And I'm sure yours, it may be different, it may look different. So I hope from this video you can get some takeaways, some possible next steps, and just share in the journey of what it means to be a parent in this day and age of devices everywhere and screens everywhere. So without further ado, let's get into it. We're going to start off by looking at, as I said, overall screen time use in terms of the daily numbers and what some of the research says. First of all, there was a study that I saw from Australia that was saying that parents are stating that screen time is the main health concern they have for their children, which I found super interesting, that screen time is the main health concern, not just a developmental concern, but a health concern. And so their advice, I think it's the Australian government, theirs advice, no screen time for children younger than 2 years, no more than 1 hour per day for children between the ages of 2 and 5, and no more than 2 hours of sedentary recreational screen time for children and young people aged 5 to 17. And this would not include schoolwork. So if they're using screens to do their schoolwork, then that is fine. And that is very similar to what the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends. No screen time for children under 2, 1 hour per day for children between 2 and 12, 2 hours per day for teens and adults. My first comment about that 2 hours per day for teens and adults from the American Pediatrics Association. I would be curious if you would just open up your phone and check the screen time and see what your numbers are. Mine are far higher than 2 hours. I'd like to say that most of my hours are used in a useful way in terms of creating maybe things for this podcast or important emails for school things for my children or what have you. But I know for a fact that's not. There's a lot of time spent on YouTube or gaming or whatever. So my first comment, and to try and put myself out there just to connect with you. When we talk about screen time, it's so important to have some awareness of what we are doing, what our habits are, and what our kids are seeing. I've tried my best to have better habits in terms of what they see me do. I have a chair in the living room that when I'm sitting in that chair, I never get my phone out. So I will possibly sit in that chair if I'm spending time with my kids, or if they are playing independently and maybe I want to read a book, I'll sit in that chair and make sure I remind myself that I'm not going to get my phone out. So just to start off, that's my first comment on that in terms of their screen time and just the hours that we're talking about. Take a moment, think about what those hours are in terms of children. My oldest son is now 4. He recently turned 4 years old, and he gets about 45 minutes of screen time a day. Normally, sometimes it won't happen at all. Normally between 30 minutes and 45 minutes. Sometimes it can be up to 45 minutes if dinner takes a long time, but normally it's closer to 30 minutes. And the younger one is often watching along with him if he is interested in whatever is on the television. But that is what we've been doing, and we kind of go back and forth with this. We change it a little bit every now and then. Having said that, though, it says no screen time for children under 2 years, and both associations recommend that. My younger one definitely would have been watching things before he turned 2 years old because his older brother was watching it at different times. These numbers from the researchers are obviously an ideal situation. I think we all know that it's not always possible. It's not always easy to meet these ideal situation numbers. So some of the research from another US government website did a study into children and adolescents about sleep guidelines, screen time guidelines, as well as physical activity guidelines, to try and look at it through those three lenses. And they actually found that the majority of the children and adolescents were meeting their sleep guidelines. They said about 88%, but then only around about 33% were meeting the guidelines of screen time, and then 23% meeting the guidelines for physical activity. It doesn't take a rocket science to look at that to see that, well, if most children are getting the right amount of sleep they have, and then maybe they're not spending the awake hours in the correct way, if we can see that maybe too many children are spending too much time on screen time and they're not getting that physical activity, we can kind of see that imbalance naturally. Maybe that's fairly an easy way to make that conclusion. But again, when we look at these numbers, it can be so easy to think about this, but in reality, when it comes to actually parenting a child, trying to make that change, we all know that it's super, super difficult. As a parent, I would love to just be able to go to my children and say, we're going to take this 30 minutes of screen time away and replace it with some physical activity, get you outside, get you running, get you doing whatever. You know, that sounds like an absolutely ideal world, and implementing that habit, if they went along with it, would obviously have some good health outcomes for them and me if I was joining in. But again, the context is important, and we know that that's not always going to be the easiest thing to achieve. So it's important to look at these numbers with an understanding that it doesn't actually reflect what a parenting journey is. So with all those numbers being said in terms of the actual amount of consumption that people are having, I thought it was really important that we actually look at what screen time means, what screen time is, and how we actually need to talk about what people are consuming, what children are consuming when it comes to the screen time. And is there different voices in this space? I mean, there's definitely different voices in the space. You can do so much research into this. And I've tried to pick a few videos you might want to go and check out, some different TED Talks, a couple of other articles. And I've tried to not go too deep into this. I think one of the things I realized when doing this research is that lots of people do have an opinion, which are obviously valid. But when you're looking into some of these screen time aspects and TV opinions, lots of people are sharing their opinion, and it's not kind of backed up on research. Even popular figures that maybe have a TED Talk or what have you. So always come in it with a grain of salt, and you need to use your own discernment when looking at it. So even listening to me right now, you need to use your discernment and understand what it is that's important to you. One of the things I did find really interesting was that same government website did find a link between language development in early years of children, that because screen time and TV time, or whatever you want to call it, is replacing quality interactions between children and caregivers, it is having an impact on their language development. So I think some people think that maybe television has this negative impact of language development just because of existing, but it seems to be that it's because it's replacing something else. Maybe it's being used in place of quality interactions, quality questions and conversations between parents and caregivers and their children. Not just parents, but obviously whomever else is in care of the child on a day-to-day basis. So that's just a really important thing to think about. It's one of those things that we can reflect on and think at the end of the day, where are those few extra minutes that I could have had a little bit of a more deep conversation? Is there something else we could have shifted over? I've spoken about in this podcast before with my children that we try our best to teach them to be bored at times and to come up with their own little games and things and conversation games when we are using public transport, for example. It would be so much easier if we're getting a 30-minute train to just put a phone in front of them and let them watch something. That would give us a bit of peace and quiet, but that's not what we want to do. So we try our best to encourage them to, look out the window, think about what they see, and then chat about what they see and come up with little games. My son and I play the Guess the Engine game, which actually came as a suggestion from previous guest Corin.
My daughter watched a bit of Thomas when she was younger. My son got very into it as well. I have a nephew who is very into Thomas, and between all three of them, we used to play a game called Guess the Engine, where you thought of an engine and the kids, or you asked the kids questions, a bit like 20 questions. You had to use various questions to narrow down who is it. Are they a steamy or are they a diesel? Are they narrow gauge or do they go on a big railway? Into colour. So we had this game that we could actively engage in. That's something we used to play in the car, sometimes at the dinner table, and taking that world into learning about here's how to ask questions. And soon the kids start to realize, okay, if I say the difference between are you narrow gauge or are you on the big railway, that halves the possible things. And if I ask the right, rather than are you Scarloey, that's a question that's can only have one answer and won't necessarily be the right one. So again, active versus passive, having different ways to engage afterwards.
And you'll hear more from Corin later on from his episode. There was lots we chatted about in terms of this topic. It was a really useful conversation that we had. So we also will just make up stories when we're on the train and on the tram and things. And now my son is 4 years old. He's starting to make up his own stories based on some of the characters that he might be watching or reading. So again, it's all part of a bigger system that kind of works together for the betterment of different aspects. So have your own discernment in terms of these quality interactions, and if that can just be improved a little bit, increased a little bit on a day-to-day basis. It's not going to be a magical fix-all, take the hour away of screen time and talk to your child for an hour. That's obviously not realistic. So I'm recording this episode towards the end of January, which is actually around the time that the TikTok ban has been going in and out of the US. I've never really used TikTok. I don't really know much about it, but it's interesting how this has been so much in the news, and the amount of people I've spoken to or opinions that I've heard online that will often pin a lot of the problems of this day and age in current modern social media. I think you could go down a huge rabbit hole of people sharing their opinion on this when you look online. Simon Sinek is obviously a well-known author. I'm going to link a video that he shared talking about an addiction to phones and social media, and how it is a similar addiction to that of being an alcoholic or having an addiction to gambling or smoking, especially when it comes for young children and their use of it in an early age, because this is when our neural pathways are being formed and our brain is being formed, the neuroplasticity of a young child's brain. So they're saying that these things that people are getting addicted to are giving dopamine out, and they're forming habits in our brain of how we respond to different stresses in our lives. So rather than learning to turn to friends or family in the times of difficulty, people turn to the thing that gives them that dopamine, whether it be gambling, alcohol, smoking, maybe social media or other screen time and whatever. So it's something that parents, I think, of very young children maybe shouldn't need to worry about too much in terms of this addiction, specifically to social media. This is what he's talking about, like the scrolling through phones and the dopamine of someone liking your post or whatever. But it is something that we need to be aware of. Before we know it, kids will be online. They'll be showing us how to do things on phones and tablets that we didn't even know about. So it's something to be aware of. That link to that video is there. And if you are obviously a parent to an older child, definitely something to think about in terms of it's trying to make that it is as big a thing to think about as smoking or gambling or alcohol. This addiction can be formed in those teenage years, so we need to be super aware of it. There are so many parents that I know and other people that you might find online that are sharing their negative opinions on social media, on screen time, and maybe we need to take some drastic measures to change this. But there are some voices out there that are saying that, we can be using devices and screens and television for positive use. The problem with it, though, is that you need to be aware of the bias. You need to show discernment in terms of where the person is coming from. There was a TED Talk which I listened to from a lady who works for PBS Kids, which is obviously the public broadcasting service in America, who obviously have some benefit in children watching their television shows, so that they might be coming from a place of bias. And she was trying to say that we should be approaching things with less fear, and that handing a phone or a device to a child when they're bored in a restaurant isn't the worst thing in the world, and that because we as parents are checking our phones lots and lots and lots, that there are actually some positives to be made from it. And I think overall, coming into something to say that we shouldn't have fear that's a good message to have. I don't think we should be approaching this topic of screen time or device use with any fear, but I just think it really lacks some of the nuance and actual perspective of what the people are consuming, what children are consuming, and what quality. Just because we as adults might be checking our phones, that doesn't mean that children should be doing that. Again, I link back to what I said earlier on. If anything, we should be looking at us first and trying to make changes in our habits first to better grow our children in this world of device use and screen time. So I think the overall message of, yes, don't approach it with fear is fine, but I don't think you can just say screens are great, devices are great, let your kids go crazy, they're going to learn. I don't think that is something that we can say. Children can learn through devices, and we're going to get on to quality and quantity soon. I think this is a really important thing you have to show real discernment when trying to learn about this topic online, because people might be coming at it with an amount of bias. There's another TED Talk that I've linked in the description from, I think it's a brain researcher who goes into some of the negative consequences of screen time and how that it's not only to blame. They were looking at a few different stories of children and what the outcomes were of different aspects of life. And I think overall they make another good point that it's not just the device use that can lead to negative outcomes, and it's not just the device use that can lead to positive outcomes. There's obviously so much going on in a child's life that we need to be hyper vigilant and hyper aware of the different aspects they're kind of relating to one another in terms of different outcomes. But again, like with anything like this, even when you look at a 10-minute TED Talk, 7-minute TED Talk, a lot of the nuance is lost, a lot of the context is lost. And I think some people could take away from that. It's like, oh, screens are good, devices are good, let's move on. With all that being said, I'm going to use that as a jumping off point to start talking about the quality and the content of screen time or device use moving forward. And I think this is this thing that is maybe lacking a little bit in terms of when parents are trying to find out about screen time or device use. You have to kind of dig a bit deeper online to find the research into these different aspects, because like those numbers I listed earlier, if you did the research and just wanted to find out about screen time, maybe you're a bit worried about screen time, you're looking at screen time, you're concerned about what your child is using, you might see those numbers in terms of hours per day or whatever, in relation to sleep and physical activity, and then just think to yourself, oh, I can't achieve that, that seems impossible, and just kind of move on. But the actual looking into what the kids are consuming and getting on board with and engaging with seems to be the more important part of the conversation, at least from all the research I've done and the parents that I've spoken to on this show. I think this is way more important and requires a lot more discussion and obviously personal discernment and personal context. Before I go any further and you just get bored of listening to me drone on and on about this, I'm going to share another clip from my conversation with Corin.
Yeah, I'm glad you used the word quality, because that I think is absolute key for several reasons. First of all, when your children get into a program, they really get into it and they will watch it time and time again. So to have something that's decent quality and doesn't grate your nerves is really important. Have something that you can enjoy watching together to talk about afterwards and use as part of imaginative play or ask questions about. That's great. When you found a program where you can do a bit of that with your kids, that's great. Now, I don't expect everyone to sit down all day, every day, watching everything that their kids watch and ask them to write an essay on it. But it's about just knowing who the main characters are, knowing a bit about the story and the adventures they go on. So you can ask them, oh, I saw in that episode the Octonauts came across a vampire squid. What do you find out about a vampire squid?
I'd really recommend checking out Corin's podcast, Beyond the Broom Cupboard. If you have any interest in kids' TV, learning more about it, learning behind the scenes, he has some amazing guests on, different voice actors and people who have played a part in the creation of lots of different kids' TV. And I really recommend one episode in particular. He had a guest called Maddie Moat, who works for the BBC, who I think she got her kind of roots in kind of being self-produced YouTuber, producing different content, who then got a job within the BBC. Really interesting story. And she had lots to say, lots of information about specifically YouTube Kids. I think she's got a lot of experience with YouTube. But overall, I'd really recommend that episode of Corin's show, as well as any others that might pop out to you, different TV shows that you or your child is interested in. So as we look at the different quality of the content that the children are consuming, we're going to focus mainly on TV shows and video games, and we'll try and look at a few other things at the end of that as well, maybe social media. But I want to start off with TV shows. There was a really interesting article on psychologytoday.com, which I'd really recommend checking out. There will obviously be a link to that dive into what the research says about the best TV shows for your kids. I'm going to paraphrase what their kind of 6 main things were, but definitely go back to that and dive into it if you are interested to learn more. I would say, from my personal understanding, my personal experience, if the thing that my child wants to watch doesn't fall into one of these 6 categories, then I'm going to try and move away from it. So it starts off with shows with a pro-social message. So anything that's modeling good social behavior. They reference Arthur, Bluey, and Dora the Explorer. There's then shows that interact with children, like Blue's Clues and Miss Rachel on YouTube. There's an article about Miss Rachel if you want to go a bit further into learning about Miss Rachel. I'm not going to talk too much about specifics because maybe not everyone is engaged with the different content, but if you want to learn more about Miss Rachel, there is another link in the description about her. So any shows that kind of go one-on-one, that kind of talk back to the child, tries to get the child to do something at home. Number 3 was the realistic shows. They referenced Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street. Number 4, shows designed for children rather than shows that are designed for adults. And they were kind of talking about that content that's not age appropriate, can lead to kids showing hyperactivity, behavioral problems. And I have found this to be true when we've tried to watch a family film with the kids, even like kids films, but kids films that are made, like our kids are now 4 and 2, they get really bored and hyperactive and crazy when we're trying to watch something that is maybe they're not their level. And I think anything longer than 40 minutes or whatever, they show some of these signs, definitely. Number 5, educational shows. I have put in my own recommendations for here, number blocks and alpha blocks. I think they are amazing in terms of getting kids used to using numbers and used to using letters. So I'd highly recommend number blocks or alpha blocks as educational shows. Another one is videos of adults reading books, which I fully would agree with. I think reading to children is amazing. I spoke about reading actually with another chap called John, and he can kind of relate to you maybe if you're struggling to find that time.
That 20 minutes a day is really good, but there's also a thing called parent guilt, and I know mothers suffer from it and fathers do too, and that, you know, you might not get 20 minutes every day, but just being actively interested in your child's life at school, and I think speaking positively about school to your kids so that they know that you value and respect the time that they spend there. So the power of a father's voice in the life of their child, it shouldn't be underestimated. And the reading doesn't always just need to be words on a page in a book at bedtime. You can be out driving. Yeah. You can be baking in the kitchen together and reading a recipe. There's so many different opportunities to be involved in that learning.
So yeah, if you struggle, like John was talking about there, finding the time to sit down with your child and do that reading each and every day, I think videos of people reading books can be really valuable. Try to find a channel that you trust. Check out a few of their videos and kind of stick with that, because you never really know the ins and outs and the quality of what people might include in their videos when they're doing these sorts of things. And I think that really applies to everything on YouTube, and that kind of relates back to what Maddie Moat was mentioning in that episode of Corin's podcast, that YouTube is always going to be a place where people can upload whatever they want. So it's not curated for children, even if it is tagged as being for children. So you do have to be vigilant and just checking things out, and finding those channels that you trust is a really, really important step to make. With that being said, I would like to add that I don't believe that online videos of people reading can adequately replace reading with a child from an adult, like a caregiver or a parent or someone that they trust. I think it's such a beneficial tool to use. I use it so much in my own parenting. We are absolutely surrounded by books. My kids love picking up books, asking myself or my wife to read to them. I would really encourage it to be something that is a huge part of children's life as they are growing up. But if it is not achievable through time purposes, or even not every child has access to lots of amazing new books, using online can be a really good way of introducing new stories to children and finding out what they enjoy. And that can be a good avenue to know which books to look for in the library or which books to look for in shops and what have you. That can be a great way to learn as well. So a really useful tool. Doesn't exactly replace the benefit of reading with a child at home, but it is a useful tool for sure. Definitely something to think about. These are the categories that this blog and this article recommends for the positive TV shows that your child can engage with, or videos they can engage with. We're going to dive into a little bit of some of the specifics a little bit later, But now I just want to talk a little bit about how we engage with our children about what they are watching, about what they're consuming. Now, as we move on to talk about quality of screen time and what they're engaging with, and we've already spoken about a few different TV shows, I did find just the manner in which the parent engages with the child can also show some interesting results. There were a couple of studies that looked at young infants watching television, kind of 6 months to 18-month-olds, two different studies that found that when parents are asking questions and labeling what they see, they're finding that infants are paying more attention and having good outcomes and showing some developmental signs with that interaction with the parents asking those questions, as well as some back and forth conversations between the parent or caregiver with the child, talking about what they're seeing on the screen. And this can bring up, again, more developmental signs, and it can help them grow their vocabulary and their language, and it can be a good way of helping them label items and what have you. So this is alluding to the idea that it's not about just plopping your child in front of the television. We can actually do it and engage with it and use it as a jumping off point to learn more. A little bit like what Corin has spoken about on his episode. I mentioned Corin a little bit earlier, but I'm going to share another clip soon. And just the quality of TV shows that we spoke about on that podcast episode I found really interesting, and how he really champions the idea of children's television not just existing within the television itself or on YouTube or on Netflix or whatever it might be, and it's up to us as parents or the caregivers of the children to bring it out of that television set and kind of make it their own world, use it as imaginative play, use it as telling stories when we're out and about. We did mention it earlier when I was going through that list from the blog of positive types of television shows for children to watch. I do want to quickly talk about Bluey. I'm going to talk about a couple of different TV shows within this podcast episode, have a little bit of a deeper dive. I'm not going to mention too many because, as I did say earlier, I'm sure there'll be some out there that not everyone has watched or wants to get engaged with or whatever, but we're not going to try and cover too many. But the thing I find interesting about Bluey, and a lot of people might come at me for this, is that we don't actually watch it at our home. I've never actually seen it. It was once on when we were at a restaurant once. It was playing in Dutch. My son watched it for a little bit. I've heard a lot about it. I know a lot about it. I know people that will go on about how good it is and what it reflects. And I actually found, interestingly enough, another TED Talk from someone that was talking about why modern parenting is turning to Bluey and using the roles and the characters in Bluey as models. So again, it's an interesting. We've just never tried to watch it. My kids really enjoy Thomas the Tank Engine, Peppa Pig, which I'm going to talk a little bit about soon, Number Blocks, Alpha Blocks, and that's pretty much it. And I've really tried to not introduce too many more characters and too many worlds to them. I don't want them to be kind of jumping on board with every time they see something that's Paw Patrol. Like they recognize Paw Patrol and they know Paw Patrol, for example, but I don't want us to kind of have that into our house. And that's just my choice. And I don't want to open up the world of Bluey to them because I just don't want to open up another world right now. Maybe eventually we'll do it. I'm not sure. But I just wanted to mention that, as we did mention it earlier, that Bluey, definitely an interesting world, and the way that the person who was given this TED Talk speaks about how even adults are enjoying it so much, and a good television show appeals to the adult as well as it does to the child. I will talk a little bit more about, as I said, Thomas the Tank Engine and Pepper just a little bit later, and my personal opinion as to why these are the ones that have kind of stuck around and we kind of like allowed to happen. So I did actually find another really interesting study that was looking at executive functioning following children's engagement with a fast-paced television show. And I feel as though this is the sort of thing that lots of people think about, lots of people seem to know about, is that children shouldn't be watching this, and this. They shouldn't be watching this. They shouldn't be watching a fast-paced thing. They should be watching something that's slow and relaxing and maybe educational. So this study, the conclusion was saying that just 9 minutes of viewing a fast-paced television cartoon had immediate negative effects on 4-year-olds' executive function. And parents should be aware that fast-paced television shows could at least temporarily impair young children's executive function. And they defined fast-paced television as a truncated episode of a very popular fantastical cartoon about an animated sponge that lives under the sea. I wonder what that was. And the educational TV show that the other group watched was a truncated episode of a realistic public broadcasting service cartoon about a typical United States preschool-aged boy. I found this research really interesting. And if you're wondering, executive function is this term that kind of applies to lots of different kind of mental skills that people need just to kind of do their day-to-day, and the memory and flexible thinking and self-control that we need to do daily tasks to help us get from point A to point B, or get us from the start of the day to the end of the day, just the generic things that children and adults have to be doing. So this study found that this 9 minutes did have this impact on the children. And again, it's very interesting. You can have this conclusion. They found that this was, they found this was their conclusion, and that it was, peer reviewed, and it's been agreed upon that this was accurate. And as we talk about this study in particular, the sample size was 60 children, 60. That's not a huge amount of children. So we can take it with a grain of salt. I think it's useful research to have out there. But what I found interesting is when you're looking for studies like this, is that I don't think there's enough of these sorts of studies to give a blanket statement about the types of television that is great. We've spoken about the things that have shown to have positive outcomes in terms of what television shows children are watching, educational shows, realistic shows, things that can help them with social skills. We see what can be positive out there, but when we talk about possible negative shows, the research seems to be lacking a little bit. Obviously, this study in particular is talking about SpongeBob SquarePants clearly, and saying that it has a negative impact on executive functioning following the 9 minutes of viewing with these 60 children in this one day and this, laboratory environment. This was their results. But that doesn't mean that 9 minute of viewing would be the same for that child, even in a different environment, at their home, watching it at a restaurant, like whatever it might be. I think it's really important that we really think about that, and it's very difficult to draw negative conclusions out of these studies because the nuance and the context is so important. Not even all the research is aligned when we're talking about these attention and the executive function and the outcomes that we're seeing in terms of children talking and engaging with fast-paced TV shows. There's another article that summarized 15 other studies. So there's this one article that's tried to look at 15 different articles and different studies and draw the conclusions based on those findings. And to put it simply, in one sentence, there's no clear answer. The ambiguity really leaves everything grey. There's no black and white to be based on it. And it can be interesting. I'm glad people have done the research. I'm glad people have taken the step to trying to combine these results and try to have some conclusions out of it. But there really just is not a black and white answer of what's good and what's bad. And this is where it's so important as parents that we apply our own unique perspective, our own contextual perspective for our children moving forward. So that's all to say that I think even if you're looking at the research, it is a very, very difficult thing to say that a TV show is necessarily bad or negative or evil. And I think it's a really dangerous comments to be made, which I have heard people say about certain television shows. And I think it can kind of get you in your head, oh, this person said that Peppa Pig is evil and everyone says that it's evil and my child watches it. Oh no, what problems have I brought upon myself? And we can kind of get caught in this rabbit in the headlights type moment. And I just don't think that the research out there is true about that. I think we need to use our own perspective of a situation and think about what television shows are going to have an impact on our children in a certain way, whether it be positive or negative. I think we can look at the positive aspects of lots of different television shows, like we've spoken about, the possible educational benefits. The modelling of social skills are hugely important, hugely beneficial, and we can talk about that from all these different shows. It is just much more difficult to agree upon the negatives found within our shows. I think that is far more contextual to you as a parent or myself. With that being said, I think that's so important. Like, that's my real big belief from doing the research for this episode. Myself, other podcast producers, authors, I don't think anyone out there can really come and say this TV show equals bad and that you shouldn't engage with it. I think it's contextual. It's important to use your own perspective. So with that being said, I'm going to jump into just a little bit on some specific shows, talk a little bit more about them. And the reason that I've chosen some of these shows is just because of my own personal experience and my family's experience. So we're going to have a look at Peppa Pig. I mentioned Peppa Pig quite a lot because My children do like it. They engage with it. I have a few comments to say about it from my own personal perspective. Even as a teacher, I had some experience with it from children watching it and having some outcomes from there. And I have also heard other parents get on the Pepper is evil. You can't let your kids watch this stuff. It is brain rot. It's going to destroy your children's brain. I've heard almost everything under the sun about Peppa Pig, so I think it's important that we have a quick chat about Peppa. There is a lady called Amy Sharong Liu. I apologise if I pronounce her name wrong. She is a professor, an associate communications professor at Northeastern University, and she says, to quote, "We don't have a lot of good characters for preschool children that are believable. I do believe that for a story to be attractive to any kind of population, believable, authentic and relatable characters will have to offend someone to create dramatic effect. You can never make everyone happy, yet only have good characters for a good story, because good stories will have to involve some elements that are not completely positive." I think that's a really interesting quote in response to when people paint Peppa Pig as evil, or they say the way that they portray Daddy Pig as being idiotic or Mummy Pig as being rude or whatever it might be. It's kind of saying that it's trying to make these characters that are partly realistic and partly relatable because people aren't perfect in the real world. Peppa Pig is realistic because she goes to playgroup, she meets new people, she makes friends, she has challenges, she encourages make-believe in some of the stories, and they're fully reflective of a preschooler learning to play the recorder, playing as pirates and burying treasure and going on a bike ride, feeding ducks, painting. Kids see themselves in these stories, which is a really interesting aspect of creating a fictional world and making a whole story about painting, which might not be the most exciting thing in the world, but kids do engage with it and they can see themselves in it, and it really encourages to help them do additional make-believe, and that is something that I have seen wholeheartedly with my kids when they do engage with it. I personally try to limit the amount of Peppa Pig that they watch and they consume, but they do like it, they do watch it, and we are able to use it like as a jumping off point when they want to do things like painting because they've seen Peppa Pig do it. And one other really good beneficial thing I've found specifically with Peppa Pig, and I think this does apply to any television show or character-based thing that you want to engage with as a parent or as a child, is that children will often desire more things with that character on, and that can also be a good thing or a bad thing. Your child might be obsessed with Spider-Man, and then you see the Spider-Man toys and the Spider-Man books and the Spider-Man plates and the Spider-Man cups at the shop, and then they want that Spider-Man thing all the time, and that can be really challenging. But one of the really good things, especially with Peppa, that I found is that there's just lots of good books that have Peppa on it. Like my son, we have a Learning to Tell the Time book that's all about a Peppa story that's got a clock on it, and he has learned to tell time by using that clock and reading that book over and over again. We have some magnet books that are Peppa Pig based, and he's been able to engage with that and get hands on. We have Dutch books that are Peppa, and we are helping us learn Dutch as well. So taking that, like I said earlier, we're taking that character and that world and taking it out of the television and implementing it in our lives in different ways, which can be a really big positive if used correctly, and if it's not just another plastic toy that's being shoved down your throat at the local supermarket or whatever. So there's obviously some nuance and some balance there. It can be frustrating having to say no to your child if they're begging you for that toy, the character that they like. But I do think there are some positives there. And I do apply that also from my experience as a teacher, trying to get kids to read, look forward to reading, engage with reading in new books. If you can find that thing that they're already interested in, maybe it is a TV character or a video game character. We'll talk a little bit more about video games soon. You can kind of lock in on that child with that character or that type of book or whatever it might be. So that is just another side point that I think is really important to talk about. That is a positive once your child is interested in a specific character or in a specific world. And I've mentioned him a few times now, but Corin, who came on the podcast a while back, he actually interviewed Sarah Ann Kennedy from Peppa Pig fame. She plays Miss Rabbit in the Peppa Pig shows, and that was a really interesting conversation. I'll put a link to that podcast episode in the description as well, where she's been on that journey with them for a long time and talking about, she shared a little bit of the background as to why they developed Peppa Pig in a certain way and how they planned Peppa Pig to achieve like how a preschooler might see themselves and the way that they might draw their own family, the way they might draw their own house up on a hill because their world is about them. And I think it's a really interesting conversation, definitely worth checking out if you're interested in learning a bit more. But yes, as we go specifically on Peppa Pig, if people come to a conclusion that they don't want Peppa Pig for their children, I think that's a perfectly understandable conclusion. I have seen some negatives from it when I was a teacher. I remember having a few children in classes, in my class or other classes, who would respond to a setback. Maybe they're trying to do something, maybe do a project or write something, and then something goes wrong. They would respond to that problem by making the sound of George Pig crying. And I remember it being distinctly annoying as a teacher. I felt it wasn't a very good coping strategy or a good emotional learning point at a 6-year-old or 7-year-old's development to be doing something like that. And there are also lots of children who just sounded just like Peppa Pig. And I think that is a symptom of something of maybe engaging with it a little bit too much. But all that to say, if you or another parent feels strongly about not having Peppa Pig in their home, I'm not trying to convince them otherwise. I'm just saying this is the reason that we have for our household and the positives that I've seen happen in our household. I would just say to whatever parent has made that decision, all power to you, make that decision, put boundaries in place, but then don't go telling other people how to live their lives and how to raise their children by claiming that the character that their child engages with is evil, which I have heard on multiple times. So, we're all on the same journey together in terms of parenting, but the actual experience looks a little bit different. So just bear that in mind, I think. I think that's a really important thing to think about. I'm just going to very quickly talk about Thomas the Tank Engine as the other TV show that my children engage with quite a lot, and maybe some of the reasons that I kind of encourage that quite a lot, I guess. Obviously, Thomas the Tank Engine started as books back in 1945, and the original stories were all handwritten. The original illustrations I find are super interesting. I really would like to get my hands on some of the original books to kind of show my kids how they've developed. But a couple of years ago, we were able to pick up the complete Thomas collection. I think it was about 68, 69 books. We got it from someone on Facebook Marketplace for about £20. Absolute bargain. And those books have been, I can't comment on how unbelievable they've been in having them in our lives. They are quite long stories. I think if you're not used to reading lots of books with your kids, you sit down and pick up one of those books and they're quite long. But I think they're just a good length to keep kids engaged. They're written in a way. And this is a bit of a tangent, but you're going to have to go with me because I feel so strongly about this. When there are books for kids and the contrast of the writing on the page is really bad, like I'm looking at Dr. Seuss's books, a lot of Dr. Seuss's books like this. This Dr. Seuss's Sleep book is a nightmare for this. Anyway, but a dark green page with black writing, and you're trying to read it to get them to sleep. You can barely see it. It's a nightmare. Anyway, the Thomas books, white page, black writing, always on the same side, and then the picture on the other side. My kids really enjoy listening to those books. They pretend to read those books. So we have a lot of those books, and we used to look a lot of the books in the library before we got this set. We obviously have the Thomas Trains toys that we have. My children often watch the Thomas television show or the Thomas movies, and I try to mostly look at the original ones in the 1980s and ensure that we've seen some of those that have started out. And what I love about those shows, I've tried to do some research and I've tried to find some articles to back up what I'm about to say, but there's not really that much out there. This is my own opinion saying this from my interaction, my opinion as a teacher as to how we look at stories. But those original television shows from the 80s, if you haven't seen it, you don't know about it, it's essentially they film a model railway, and they have special things to shoot out steam. They have different faces that they change between, so the engines will have expressive faces and their eyes can move with remote controls, which is how they make it. But yeah, it's all a model railway, and they film it in creative ways, and then they have a narrator tell the story on top of the film. And I think, from what I've seen and the way that my children engage with stories and the way that someone would tell a story to a child, a television show with a narrator, I find is such an important or such a useful tool and an important skill for children to learn, because the story isn't just spoon-fed to them. It's not everything happening on the screen at the time. The characters all have different voices, which make it very clear who's talking and who's doing what. It's not super visual. It's not lots of like explosions or flying. It's, a lot of the time the engines are staying still. They'll move, they'll stop, they'll talk, then they'll move, they'll stop, and they'll talk. And there's not a huge amount happening in the show. So for the child to understand what's happening in the story, they have to listen to the narration and make connections between, blah, 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 Thomas said, and then Edward said, and they have to follow along with that narration and understand those words. And at first they might not understand it, but once they get there eventually, I think that's a really, really useful thing for children to see. Thomas has then come on to lots and lots of other things. It went through a phase of being part model railway, part CGI, part computer graphic, and now there's the more modern ones are all generated, which are fine. Some of those stories are okay. They still have a narrator, but they would have some voices in as well. I'm not a huge fan of the super modern Thomas thing. I don't even know what you call it, but there's a cartoon version of Thomas now, and that is physics breaking, which I don't know. He will jump up and move around, and I don't appreciate all of that. So we don't engage with that. But I think the Thomas, that's why I'm a big fan of Thomas and why I try to encourage it and engage with it with my children quite a lot. I did just want to take the time to talk about one final, television show, YouTube channel that gets a lot of mentions and a lot of press, got lots of views, and that is CoComelon. I'm sure you have opinions about CoComelon. It's obviously everywhere. This YouTube channel that has lots of videos and lots of comments are levied at it about it being too fast-paced and can lead children to be overstimulated and upset and angry when it gets shut off and things like that. Again, I've tried to do some research. There's not a huge amount specifically into it. I found an article talking about it that kind of compiled some parent comments. I'll give a link to that in the description as well. But in this article, they actually referenced that study that I already mentioned about the children that were watching fast-paced television of having impacts on their executive function, which kind of goes to show that there's not a huge amount of actual scholarly research into some things like this that maybe could be a useful thing for us to develop, for sure. I mean, I'm no scientific researcher, but it would be something that I would be curious about to kind of drive into a little bit more. So a lot of the people talk about CoComelon and being that it is, well, I'm just going to read a couple of comments. The most epic meltdown we had was while shutting off CoComelon to get her ready for her bath. It was on another level. I said right there and then that the show is banned in the house. And, I believe this person. I believe that this happened. But I think you can make a comment about how this content is being consumed. Is a child being sat down in front of it with no boundaries, with no time limits, with no understanding of what's going to happen, and then it just gets shut off? That pulls the rug from under them and their expectations because they don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how old the child was as well, so, it's a difficult comment to kind of apply to our own life. And when you think about this article has pulled that comment out of 300 forum posts on Reddit, it's not really something that I think is super applicable. And then someone else said, my toddler doesn't zonk out to that stuff. It sometimes plays in the background while he plays or draws. So it just kind of goes to show just how different people can be. My personal opinion with CoComelon, I think my oldest son, he enjoyed some of the videos early on, but we were very specific about which one he wanted, to watch Head, Shoulders, Knees and Toes, for example. So I think you could use CoComelon as I want my child to learn this song. Maybe they want them to learn the ABC song, the alphabet song. So you're very intentional about sitting down. We're going to watch this video. We're going to maybe watch it 3 or 4 times to practice the song together, and then we're going to turn it off. And I'm not just going to plop it on and let it run from 45 minutes to an hour and then turn it off at a random time. I think that whole world of children not knowing their boundaries and their expectations, that can be what leads to overstimulation and meltdowns and tantrums and things like that. So it's definitely something to think about. Again, you might have your own strong opinions about CoComelon, which I think is absolutely fine. I just wanted to quickly mention it as it is a very commonly spoken about topic. It is very fast-paced, but I still believe that it could be used as a tool for a certain reason. But yeah, maybe don't just plop your child down in front of it for an extended period of time. So I could dive into so many different shows and TV shows, YouTube channels, movies even, here and go through these different lenses of different experiences and what the research might say, but this episode will then go on for half a day, and I really would just encourage you to take the time to personally watch these shows and these movies and make your own observations. Seek out professional or expert help if you think it's going to be useful. I personally can find other parents' comments on message boards sometimes not the most helpful for things like this, because people are often sharing their really extreme experiences, whether that be positive or negative. You very rarely see the 3-4 star reviews of things. It's often the 5 and the 1 star reviews. So I would say bear that in mind. A really useful tool that I would recommend to anyone that is looking into the details of a specific TV show, movie, or video game would be IMDb. IMDb have a parent guide for every title on their website, which can feature, I think the publisher can put in some information in there. It often features other parents' comments on things, which I find a little bit more useful because they have it narrowed down into the specific areas of what you might expect out of a movie. Are there references to violences? Are there references to drugs? Are there references to sex? All that sort of stuff is kind of a bit more guided. So I find that as a really useful tool if you want to get a quick snapshot of a certain game or TV show or movie or whatever. So finally, talking of video games, it's time to move on and talk a little bit about video games, the impact of video games, because as we're talking about screen time, it's not just about screen time, it's about the content and what the kids are doing on the screens. So let's have a quick chat about video games. I'm just going to get my bias out there. I played so many video games as a teenager. It was kind of insane. I played a lot of role-playing games. I played so much FIFA, the football or soccer game, Football Manager as well on my computer. Hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, days and days worth of playing time on things like Football Manager and FIFA, but also played a lot of things like Final Fantasy and Fable and Skyrim, like all those sorts of things. I put so much time, even The Sims. I played a lot of time into video games. It was a huge part of my teenage years, even early teenage or pre-teenage years as well. So I want to say that I don't really play any video games now. I do have one game on my phone that I sometimes play, and I do have not the most recent FIFA release or the football game release from EA. I had the last one, which I used to play a little bit, but don't really have time for anymore. And I just don't find the time or make the time for video games anymore. I think they're useful. I think they're beneficial. This is my view. They can be a nice way to unwind. If I met another adult that told me that they play video games, I'd be like, cool, like we could have a chat about it. But I often look back on my time as a child, as a teenager, that it maybe wasn't the best use of my time. I think some of the hours that I put into it could have been used in such a more positive and beneficial and building up way. So that is just my reflection on my own childhood, my own teenage years. I don't slight my parents in any way about this. I think I was quite a difficult teenager. It was probably quite a relief just to know that I was safe in my room playing a video game. So whatever, but that's just my own personal reflection and my own kind of opinion on them right now, is that I think that I personally probably put too much time into them as a teenager, and I would like to avoid that for my kids. That is my personal feeling right now, before we start talking about the research and taking that into consideration. So, and even the state of video games right now as opposed to what it was about 20 years ago. So, with that being said, let's get into some of the research. So I've got a few studies to talk about, just talking about general hours of video games, general results that they found in video games. There was one study that found that cognitive performance was better for children who play video games for 3 hours or more each day. And they found that there was improvement within the cognitive skills involving impulse control and working memory compared to children who never played video games. Interesting. Obviously, all the links to all these sort of things will be in the description if you want to read more about this study. It was 2,000 children they studied in this. 3 hours a day sounds absolutely insane to me. Like that's the sort of number that I'm talking about myself when I was a teenager, that I felt as though I let video games take over my schoolwork, my social life, different aspects of my life, because I was wanting to do 3 hours every day. You know, I'm not going to judge anyone that chooses to spend 3 or more hours on a weekend, like blitzing through a new video game or just kind of losing themselves in a video game. I think that's a fairly healthy choice if someone wants to do that. But I think neglecting other responsibilities like homework when you're a teenager, or spending time with friends, or spending time with your family even, when you finish school and before you go to bed, if you're using 3 hours of that time on a video game, to me that sounds like too much. Like, that's just my personal opinion reading this study. So I think it's an interesting study. Like, they've obviously found this result. I would argue, I find it interesting that they use 3 hours as the benchmark, as that's the amount. I would be curious as to, can they dilute the research a little bit more, maybe do another study and see, is 1 hour enough to get some of these similar results of the majority approving a positive result on their cognitive responses. So an interesting study for sure. I would encourage you to go and look into a little bit further. To me, I still think 3 hours is a bit too much, but that's for me. There's another study here that has found that video games can support the children's sense of autonomy, competence, creativity, and identity, as well as help them regulate emotions and build relationships. But in order to support one or more of these aspects of well-being, games should consider certain features. For example, to support children's sense of autonomy, a game could put them in control, allowing them to make decisions about gameplay and encourage them to develop their own strategies to progress. Or to support creativity, a game could allow children to freely explore and solve problems or create their own characters or narratives. That's taken from this study. Again, it will be linked. Interesting. I can see this as being totally true. I think anyone who's played certain types of video games would know this should be true from their own experience, that children develop their creativity when they play games like Minecraft, or they develop a sense of autonomy when they're playing games that have some form of progression and development. I agree with that. I think a study like this can be useful for people that maybe don't play video games, so they can get kind of an overall picture of what some of the positives can be. So I personally agree with this. I think this is useful. I hope that other people find it useful too. But yeah, an interesting one. You can go a little bit further into that if you want to find more. There's a lot of details in there, but we're not going to spend too much. I think the general sense is that different video games can provide different positives. But again, it's really important that we know what those positives are, what we're aiming for, and then have the boundaries in place to ensure that that's what it is going to be, rather than it extending into something else entirely. Those are some of the studies that look at the positives of video games, and I think it's quite important to be aware that, yeah, there are different positives of video games, and we can take that moving forward into the next part of our conversation. In the description, there'll also be a link there to what I'm about to talk about next. It's not really a study, it's more of an article about one particular person, one particular man, and this is a man called Anthony Rosner from London. And basically, this article is from 2014, so it's quite old, but I think it's quite interesting, of like a case study to look deeply into what a video game has done to someone's life and what we need to be aware of kind of moving forward in terms of how we serve and provide support for video games for our children. So basically, long story short, this gentleman found himself completely addicted to the World of Warcraft video game. To quote him, he said, "I never saw my real friends. I gained weight, became lazy, and spent nearly all of my time slumped over my computer. He played up to 18 hours a day for nearly 2 years." So yeah, that is a lot of time. And the article does go on to talk about some studies in terms of the MRI studies on brains of some students that played a lot of time, specifically on World of Warcraft. It was a very small study, so the outcomes are obviously to be taken with a grain of salt. But they're talking about how that researchers believe that excessive gaming at a certain age can physically rewire the brain. And this links back to what Simon Sinek was talking about in his podcast episode, or the interview that he was in, about the dopamine releasing activities and how addictive these things can become when our brain is developing. This is why children under the age of 18 shouldn't drink alcohol. It's why they shouldn't have lots of caffeine. It's why they shouldn't be smoking, because their brain is developing and their brain can become used to having these things, and those addictions can be so much harder to break if they're formed before certain ages. It's very similar, it seems, with some video games. And there's actually another study that was published in the scientific journal Nature, which was back in 1998, showed that playing video games releases the feel-good neurotransmitter dopamine. The amount of dopamine released while playing video games was similar to what is seen after intravenous injection of the stimulant drugs amphetamine or methylphenidate. So, this study is still quite old, but as we say, this is biology, this is chemistry, this is our bodies, this is how they work, this is how they respond to things. I don't think we would have changed much. So some video games, or playing video games, releases this dopamine, makes us feel good, and it's addictive. And this is to quote that other article again with Rosner talking about World of Warcraft. The dopamine release that comes from gaming is so powerful, say researchers, it can almost shut the prefrontal regions down. That's one reason why gamers like Rosner can play for 18 hours straight. Kids plop themselves down in front of a computer and they'll stay there for 8, 10, 25 or 36 hours, says Dr. Greenfield, who is a founder of the Center for Internet and Technology Addiction and the Assistant Clinical Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. We as parents, I believe, can hear something like this and all agree that this is not something that we would want to happen. Like, we can look at our children, we say we don't want them to become drug addicts. We don't want them to become alcoholics. We don't want them to become addicted to social media. We don't want them to become addicted to video games. All of these things do need to come into a similar conversation and be protected in a similar way. I relate to what Dr. Greenfield was saying here with this shutting the prefrontal regions down. The part of your brain just kind of shuts down and kind of forgets about life. And there were some days that I would spend a serious amount of time on some of these video games like Football Manager or even The Sims on computer, or whichever role-playing game I was playing on the PlayStation, or whatever it might be. You know, and it would get bright outside. It'd be 4 a.m. before I'd even gone to bed, because like my brain is just not thinking about other things. It's just releasing this dopamine, and it's just like, this is good, this is good, this is good, this is good, this is good. Keep going, keep going, keep going. I don't think anyone wants to achieve that as something that we're happening in our children day-to-day basis. With all that being said, though, quoting these different articles and talking about an addiction to video games, it does seem to be that video game addiction is difficult to define, and that different places, different researchers don't quite agree on what it is, in the same way that an alcoholic or a drug addiction seems to be fairly well understood. It seems as though video game addiction, people kind of disagree upon. Maybe that's where the grey area comes in, when they're not able to act out effectively and effective strategies. Some studies that are showing that action video games can enhance certain visual capabilities, like tracking multiple objects and rotating objects, storing them in memory centers in the brain. And there are also different strategies that we use. Multitasking. To quote Dr. Judy Willis, who is a neurologist and educator at the American Academy of Neurology, she says that there's very much like the multitasking inherent in most jobs today, talking about multitasking within a video game being a positive thing that we learn that can apply to real life. She goes on to say, these young people may be better equipped to switch between tasks easily, adapt to new information, and modify their strategy as new input comes in. And now I think multitasking is also a topic that could even be its own episode, that some people are so keen on multitasking that maybe they get to a point where they're not able to focus on one thing. And I hear anecdotally a lot from people that are interacting with younger people, students and what have you, that they're not able to focus on one task or even sit through a movie because they're so used to massively overly stimulation, different stimuli. So multitasking is a good thing, I guess, that is needed in jobs, but again, that's another rabbit hole that we're not going to go down in this episode. To wrap all that up in terms of what the research says, we're still going to get into a few other things on video games. We're not done yet. So video games are complicated, if not more so than television shows. Different genres have different outcomes on the brain, and children have a developing brain which can become addicted more easily. So I will share some personal experience of video game use and talk of what other research I can find, but we're not going to spend too much time on specific games or even genres, as again, we would be here forever. That could maybe be a discussion for another time, or up to you to do your own research using some of the tools that I've mentioned. So, a little personal experience in terms of my children playing video games. They are only 4 years old and 2 years old, so there's not really much that's happened in our life. The only thing I can really talk about are 2 games that we have on my wife's old tablet, which is a Number Blocks game and a Thomas the Tank Engine game. Now, the Number Blocks game we did pay for. I can't remember how much it was, but it's got a progression map you can walk through and play different activities, and it is very similar to the show if you've seen it, where you can drag numbers together. It's asking you to pick the right numbers to make the new one. There's There's a game where you pretend to be a shopkeeper or a customer, and you make sure you give over the right amount of money. There's all these different things, and they have little video clips in as well. There's a progression. You unlock characters, you unlock hats and different ways to dress your characters. It's fun. It's good. I approve of it when my son plays it. I think it's a net benefit. I think it's a good way for him to engage with it. Obviously, the 4-year-old is the one playing with it. His brother might be watching and trying to interact with it, but he's not quite there yet. Overall, I think that's a net positive. The other game that they sometimes play is a Thomas the Tank Engine game. Now, full disclosure, we haven't paid for this game. We only have the free version, so I don't know the full experience. But the game itself is just pressing a button to make the train go, and then you press another button to make it go faster, and you have a race around a track, and then you can unlock other engines and improve your engines and have that development. And the thing that's locked out for us is unlocking the extra engines. To me, this screams trying to grab a child's attention and just get them hooked into it and not provide much actual learning opportunity or interest. I think that the actual gameplay is very monotonous. It's just tap, 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 tap. And then it's the, I want to unlock this other thing, demand parent to pay for it. And then, again, I think linking back to what I was saying about the video games that I used to play, I think so many video games have tapped into this now that they know that you give someone a progression path, you give someone improvements, they want to keep going, they want to unlock this, they want to get new skills, they want to improve their abilities. That's very common. We're going to see that everywhere. But this Thomas game is just that, and bashing a forward button to make your train go. There's no other real strategy or learning or understanding that comes with it. So I personally try to not let them go on that one too much if possible. They really don't ask to play the video games at all. They'd rather just sit for 20 minutes and watch the television, which I think kind of talks into more just the use for screen time that we have is more of like an unwind, relaxing. They just want to sit there and kind of watch it for a little bit before dinner time. That's kind of how we use it in our household. As we're talking about different video games and the content, I would like to play a clip from my interviews of Leo. He is a video game developer, and in our interview, we spoke a little bit about Roblox.
Let's begin with I only checked Roblox for a couple of hours myself. I only read about or watched reviews. I think what they did is amazing. Roblox is an amazing game where you can make anything happen in there, but since you can make so much in there, it's impossible for anyone to have control over what can happen. I instructed my son not to accept any kind of friend request from anyone he doesn't know, because there's also a case of a kid giving I think it was credit card information to a supposed friend. They are kids. They don't understand. And if we look back on our days, my mother always said, do not talk to strangers, do not give them money, do not show them your house. And this is kind of the same thing. I mean, I can't keep my son in a bubble forever, so that's why I said, okay, you can play Roblox. But I did gave him some instructions on what to do, on what the do's and don'ts. And the same thing happens. He forgot about Roblox like a month after starting playing, and he's now into Squad Busters, which is another game. You have less interaction with other people, but you still need to be very careful because I don't know if this happens to you, but scammers are much smarter than me. Like, I cannot think of that level of work they are doing. I mean, wow. Yeah,
for sure.
And there's no way. Maybe people say, "Oh, the developers should control that." How? I mean, to avoid something, you would need to think about it first. And I'm telling you, I'm not smart enough.
So he's kind of talking similarly to what I've mentioned here, in that you need to put the time and effort into make your own decision about whether you think something or not is safe. You can't just Google, "Is Roblox good for my kid?" and get a yes or no answer. Put the time and effort in, put the boundaries in. Think about how your child will respond to certain things, and then kind of go from there. I have found that less so with Roblox and more so with Minecraft, that my time as a teacher, I found these worlds to be actually quite useful because it was a way in which to engage children into reading in particular. I remember one of the classes I had, they went absolutely crazy for the different Minecraft books we had in the library at our school, and there was even one child that came into my class in year 2 who should have already had some reading skills. Like, he should already have been like kind of doing some basic sentences and sounding things out and had most of sight words down. That's the kind of like the grade level average. He was nowhere near that. He just about knew the kind of letter sounds of like A, B, B, and so on. And I got him at the end of the year, far and away, progressed, developed. Obviously, he had a lot of help from the other learning support team. But one of the things I really liked, that I think is a big reason why he had made that development, was that he wanted to be able to read the Minecraft books we had in the library. And that was a total independent motivation that he came himself. It wasn't like us telling him, here's a stack of books, we want you to read The Cat in the Hat or Green Eggs and Ham or whatever it is, whatever book, like we want you to get here by the end of the year. It was him thinking that he wanted to read that Minecraft book. So then he had the motivation to learn to read. And I think this mentality can apply to lots of different things. Like my kids learning to tell the time via the Pepper book, then they're interested in that Pepper book because it's Pepper, but now they're interested in time because of that book. And they already had the interest in Pepper. They're interested in the memory game we have, that's Pepper, because of Pepper, not because it's a memory game. Now they've been developing their memory. And I think this sort of thing applies all across the board. And I think with reading in particular, it's such a useful thing to tap into that if your child is already interested in a character or a video game or a TV show, a movie, whatever it might be, chances are if it's a big enough franchise, you will find a book that you can use as a tool to encourage your kid to read more based on that thing that they already know about, that character they already know about, that TV show they already know about. So I think that's really good. Let's move on just a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about Minecraft. I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive into Minecraft because it's such a huge thing. This is just kind of as an example as to like what I think is important to talk about. We obviously heard from Leo talk about Roblox, really important example. I'm going to talk a really tiny bit about Minecraft. There's actually a guide on Minecraft's website of how to set it up, what's important. And then I have linked a guide from a website called funtech.co.uk about what parents need to know about Minecraft. The long and short of it is it's available for kids that are 8 years old. It seems to be that when you set up an account, if you register as under 13, so between 8 and 13, there are some elements that are locked out of it, like making in-game purchases, which I think is an important thing. I'm probably not going to spend too much time talking about in-game purchases, but that's something to be aware of. But obviously children may know how to get around this sort of thing. And there obviously are some aspects of Minecraft, if you don't know about it, it's a building game that inspires creativity, but also has this survival aspect. And there are things that come and attack you, and you have to learn how to defend yourself and build your own defense system or attack them yourself. So I think 8 is probably fine. There are some kids that maybe do it a little bit earlier, like maybe that's a choice of their parents, but definitely do the research into this guide if you want to learn a little bit more about it. The links will be in the description. This just tells us an important aspect of safety with kids is that you should be there when they're setting up accounts, and you need to ensure that they're being truthful, go alongside them, make sure everything comes through and is, as you expect, and that they're not trying to trick the system. Interestingly enough, when I was doing a bit of research, I learned that Minecraft actually has an educational platform that is used in schools even. So you see how some people have responded to Minecraft as being this useful tool to encourage creativity and building and problem solving and task management. So there's a link if you want to learn more about it. I'm not going to go into it too much here. I've also got a link if you want to learn more about Roblox, about it being safe. I think Leo has spoken a lot about it, which is interesting and useful knowledge if you want to dive into that. A personal experience I've had with Roblox, which I did mention in that episode where I interviewed Leo, that if you did listen to it, you might have heard it already. But when I was a teacher, Squid Game suddenly just took over like our school and our classes, and so many of these kids were mentioning it. And bear in mind that I was teaching year 2, so these kids were like 6 and 7 years old. I'm like, why are they mentioning Squid Game? And I did find out that 1 or 2 children were watching it with their parents, and we approached that with the parents in a fitting way, I felt, with the kind of senior leadership team to not judge their parenting, but maybe, again, just provide them with some tools to make informed decisions in terms of what is healthy for a developing brain and certain responses when it comes to emotional response, because I had seen an emotional response from certain children being a very violent response, and I think it partly was due to the content that was being consumed. But what had happened with Squid Game was that we learned that there was lots of Squid Game-based games within Roblox, or Squid Game-inspired games within Roblox. So kids that were in Roblox were getting access to these Squid Game skins or games that they were playing. So then they learned about some of the outfits and the games that were in there, and the girl with the creepy head. So they learned about these things. They maybe didn't know about the violence and the storyline, but it still sits a little bit weird with me. I don't know what your opinions are, but I feel as though that's something that we shouldn't be doing. We shouldn't be encouraging kids to kind of be buying merch for a TV show which is very much adult only. That's my personal opinion. Again, I've mentioned the IMD Parent Guide. I'm going to put a link to that in the description. There's also some other tools, online tools, about keeping your children safe and making sure that the boundaries are set up properly on your devices and on your router to ensure that the content that's getting to them is only what you should want. So that's such an important thing that I'm not going to go too much into. I think you have to do the research yourself into your router, your device, and the way that your kids use devices, if they have their own device or if they're using someone else's device. So just think about that. We're coming up to the conclusion now. So conclusion time. I've rambled on a lot. I thank you so much if you have got all the way to the end of the episode. I apologize if you're in a situation where you can't skip the podcast and you just happen to end up here, but I'm glad that you're here anyway. So, the conclusion. Are you going to make a change? How are we going to make a change? I would just say that balance is important. That's what I've been saying throughout this whole time. I don't think any one TV show or video game or movie or device is inherently bad or evil. I think they have different purposes for different people. Obviously, there is content which is age appropriate or not, and I fully agree with ensuring that content is age appropriate and not exposing children to things that is not appropriate for their age, and we should trust the regulators when they say that something is for a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old or whatever it might be. I kind of like leave it at that in terms of it being age appropriate. But outside of that, I don't think anything is inherently evil. I don't like people saying Cocomelon is evil or Peppa Pig is evil or video games are evil. I don't believe that. Balance is super important, and understanding what balance looks like in your family. So the quality over the quantity as a focus. Like I spoke about with Corin all the way back when I mentioned his clip. Quality of the TV show or quality of the video game. What is it actually providing? Rather than should they be having 30 minutes or 50 minutes? Rather that being the discussion. What is the quality that's happening? What's the outcome? Are we able to talk about it? Does it become a positive conversation topic at the dinner table? Are we able to discuss? Are we able to dive into it? Does it become its own living, breathing world outside of the video game or the TV show? I think that's really good. So how do we make a change? Small shifts. Like, you can't suddenly take away a child's 1 hour screen time every day and just take it away. Maybe that hour can become 45 minutes. And then after a few weeks, that 45 minutes can become 30 minutes. Those small shifts, definitely what's going to be needed. In terms of habits, I do have a quick link in here about trying to break a bad habit. If you think that something has become a habit, I did think that my children were showing a bad habit in terms of demanding television time towards the end of the day. And I've tried our best to fix that behavior and that habit by trying to replace some more things in the afternoon that we're doing. And the whole afternoon doesn't always become about talking about TV time and the build up to possible TV time. It is a something that they can have as a privilege, as an extra, if everything has gone well, and that comes by replacing, more reading time, more specific play time. We get the Play-Doh out, we get the sand out, whatever it might be in the afternoon, making sure that there is something there that is replacing it and replacing that habit. So I haven't had to, but I did think about, maybe Monday will become Play-Doh day, Tuesday will become kinetic sand day, Wednesday will become playground day, whatever it might be, or outdoor day. Like, those sorts of things might help break some of these habits, and then we can reintroduce TV time if that's what was needed. The article that I mentioned about breaking a habit, this mentions to put systems in place, so routine structure, device-free zones could be really useful. Social pressure, thinking about, are your children being pressured by other kids? We haven't spoken too much about that, but it is something to bear in mind, definitely in terms of Minecraft and Roblox, and everyone wants to join in, and maybe the kids aren't pressuring them specifically, but that kind of subconscious pressure that a child might feel if they are not getting access to the same thing, definitely very, very important. And a growth mindset. I can do this. We can do this. We can make a change. We can have a positive impact. We can look at the quality of the things that we're doing. We can do this. So if you think your kids are addicted, there are resources out there. There's videos of people's experiences and methods to get out of it and move forward. From what I see, there are two possible options of experiences that people have had. A big removal of everything for everyone and have lots of new restrictions about what's happening, lots of just a huge change. Some people have had positive success with that, and that's good. Or a bit of a slower, small introductions of expectations and limitations and things, and just kind of going at small steps at a time. Definitely both useful. One of the things I have seen a lot of times when we're talking about reducing the screen time, just getting it down, you need to reflect on the common times when the TV shows are going to go on. Like, is it when the kids wake up in the morning? Is it after their nap time? Is it right before dinner time, like it was for us and our family? Then you kind of approach that time like, what can we put in this time? What are we doing in this time? And rather than just like, I'm taking this away, and then the child screams, again, we're talking about it and having that reflection. So with all that to be said, you need to use your judgment, analyze the situations, and use some elements of research to make the best call. Because every child, every family is different. And I would really encourage you, like I said earlier, not to get caught up in this whole, this character is evil or this TV show will rot your kid's brain. Just approach things with your clear mind and have your awareness about you when talking about these sort of things with your kids. Do the research. If you think hearing other people's opinions on the topic, find the message boards, but use the tools like the IMDb Parent Guide. I really appreciate you listening to this episode. I'm kind of sorry at the end of it. I'm just saying that you need to use your own judgment and your best call, but I think that's just what parenting is so often of the time. Like, there isn't really that much black and white. And I think that's the thing that really surprised me about parenting. Just a side note, I'm surprised about parenting that there's not as much black and white in parenting as maybe people tell you there's going to be when you're preparing for pregnancy. I mean, I look back and like being a parent, I feel like the only black and white thing I can remember was that don't give your baby honey. Honey can kill your baby. And like everyone agrees on that. There's no like kind of like argument or positives or whatever it might be, or situations where you might do it. It's just like, do not give your baby honey until they turn 1. And like, that's what everyone says. I mean, other black and whites, like, I don't know, like send me an email or comment down below if you're on YouTube. Like, what are the black and whites that you've kind of built your parenting life on? If you've got this far in the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. Again, if you've got this far, tell me what's your big takeaway from this episode. I hope what I've shared is useful. There's going to be so many links in the description to dive a little bit deeper, do some of your own research. But I hope this structure has been useful for you. I hope you can see the heart I have towards this kind of topic of talking about it, bringing in expert research, bringing in the other guests I've had on the podcast and sharing my experience as well. I hope this has helped you come to some arrangement or some action point about screen time and device use within your family, or maybe it shifted the perspective a little bit. So yeah, reach out to me if you have any questions. You can get me at daddialoguepodcast@gmail.com, or you can go over to daddialogue.co.uk if you'd like to get in touch through there, or sign up to be a guest on the interview side of the podcast. This episode of the Dad Diary Deep Dive was completely free on YouTube and other podcast platforms. Future episodes of the Dad Diary Deep Dives will go onto the Dad Dialogue Patreon, which is patreon.com/daddialogue. Sign up over there if you would like to get access to future episodes of Dad Diary Deep Dive, as well as early access of the interviews and shout outs of your name for supporting the channel. I would really appreciate your support, so please do go over there and support the channel. If you have any input of what the next Dad Diary Deep Dive should be, what topic we can look at, please let me know as well. I'd love to hear from you. With all that being said, thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great day, and I really hope to talk to you again soon. Goodbye. Woo!